He opened his eyes to a new world, and an alien girl was waiting. Felt was a pounding headache, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to his skull. The second was the unfamiliar. Softness beneath his back, definitely not the hard bunk of his military transport. His eyelids fluttered open then. Immediately squeezed shut against the bright artificial light, flooding his vision. What the hell, he muttered, raising a hand to shield his eyes. As his vision adjusted, Jeremy realized he was lying on a bed in what appeared to be a dormitory. The walls were a pristine white, with strange flowing script etched into them that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Various objects floated on anti-gravity. Shelves, books, strange devices, and what looked like plants from a dozen different worlds. Jeremy tried to sit up, only to discover he was wearing nothing but dark blue briefs. His muscled torso was completely exposed, and there was no sign of his uniform anywhere. Panic began to rise in his chest as fragmented memories surfaced. The mission, the unexpected anomaly, the blinding flash of light, and then nothing. Finally awake, a soft, melodic voice asked from somewhere to his right. Jeremy whipped his head around so fast, he nearly gave himself whiplash. Sitting at the foot of his bed, one leg tucked beneath her, was quite possibly the most striking woman he'd ever seen, if she was human, which she clearly wasn't. Her skin was a vibrant, luminous red that seemed to glow under the rooms, lighting. Long, silvery white hair cascaded down her back and over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. Her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and a startling violet color with no visible pupils. She wore a tight matte black bodysuit that left her shoulders, legs, and a generous portion of her chest exposed, accentuating a figure that would make supermodels weep with envy. But what struck Jeremy most was the expression on her face, pure, undiluted scientific curiosity, as if he were a particularly fascinating specimen under a microscope. Who the are you, Jeremy demanded, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall. Where am I? What happened to my ship? The alien woman tilted her head, those violet eyes studying him with increased interest. Your speech patterns match the linguistic database perfectly, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She leaned forward close enough that Jeremy could smell something like cinnamon and ozone emanating from her. I've never seen a living human this close before. Her slender fingers reached out, and before Jeremy could react, she was tracing the contours of his face with a touch so light it was barely perceptible. Stop, that Jeremy batted her hand away. His military training kicking in as he assessed potential escape routes. The room had one door and what appeared to be a large window overlooking. Holy, was that a space station? The red-skinned woman didn't seem offended by his reaction. If anything, she looked even more intrigued. Fascinating, defensive response. Is this typical human behavior? When confronted with the unknown lady, you've got about 5 seconds to tell me where I am before you. What? She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp to be human. You're currently in my dormitory at the Galactic Conflict University, specifically the Xenobiology Wing, and you, Jeremy Hayes, are the subject of my graduation research project. Jeremy froze. How do you know my name? Your identification tags, she replied, gesturing to a small table where his dog tags lay. I'm Kala, by the way. Kayala Tenari, 4th-year xenobiology student, specializing in emergent sentient species. She extended a hand in what was clearly an attempt to mimic a human greeting. Your species custom is to shake hands. Correct. Jeremy ignored the offered hand. How did I get here? Last thing I remember, I was on a recon mission near the Ark tourist sector. Kyla's expression shifted to something that might have been guilt. Ah, yes, about that. Your vessel encountered one of our university's research probes. It seems the automated defense systems interpreted your approach as hostile and well teleported. You hear teleported Jeremy, repeated incredulously. That's impossible, we don't have that technology, you don't. Kyla agreed cheerfully. We do, though I should clarify, only you were teleported your vessel, and crew continued on their way. Likely assuming you were killed, in what they would perceive as a minor explosion. The implications hit Jeremy like a punch. To the gut his crew would report him, as Kaya no one would be looking for him. He was effectively stranded in what appeared to be an alien university, wearing nothing but his underwear, being studied by a beautiful red-skinned woman who looked at him like he was an interesting bug. He groaned. Running a hand through his short brown hair, Kay's eyes widened. Is that an invitation or an expression of dismay? The database is unclear on the contextual usage, despite everything. Jeremy couldn't help but let out a bark of laughter, expression of dismay. Definitely, he took a deep breath. Military training, kicking in, assess the situation, adapt, survive, so I'm what? Your labet, now. Oh, nothing so crude, Kayala assured him, looking mildly offended. You're a research subject, yes, but with full autonomy and rights. The ethics committee would have my head otherwise. She paused, and then added with a hint of pride, you're actually the first human to ever set foot on our campus. You know, we've observed your species from afar for centuries, but direct contact has been limited, Jeremy repeated flatly. And why is that? Kyla's expression turned diplomatic. Let's just say your species has a reputation for being somewhat volatile when encountering new civilizations. That's rich coming from someone who just kidnapped me. Not kidnapped, Kyla corrected quickly, rescued. The probe's defensive measures would have vaporized you otherwise. The teleportation was a fail-safe. Jeremy wasn't buying it, but arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. He needed information, and this Kyla seemed willing to talk. So, what happens now? He asked, cautiously relaxing his defensive posture. Kyla brightened immediately. Now, you help me complete my thesis on human adaptability in non-terrestrial social structures. In return, you'll be given accommodation, sustenance, and eventually, once my research is complete, we can discuss returning to your people. She clapped her hands together. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Sounds like I don't have much choice, Jeremy muttered. There's always choice, Kyla said, suddenly serious. If you truly wish to leave, arrangements can be made, but I should warn you, the bureaucracy involved would take approximately 1 standard solar cycle. And in the meantime, you'd be placed in quarantine, rather than allowed to freely experience our campus. Jeremy weighed his options. Quarantine in some alien facility versus playing along with this bizarre research project. At least, the latter would give him freedom to move, gather information, maybe even find a way home on his own terms. Fine, he said finally. I'll help with your research, but I want clothes, information, and some goddamn privacy. Call's face lit up with genuine delight. Excellent, I've already prepared appropriate attire based on human physiological requirements. She bounded off the bed with inhuman grace and retrieved a stack of clothing from a nearby drawer. These should fit. The fabric adapts to body temperature and environmental conditions. Jeremy accepted the clothes, a simple black shirt and pants that felt like some kind of synthetic material, along with boots that looked surprisingly similar to his military-issue ones. I'll give you privacy to change, Kyla said, moving toward the door. When you're ready, I'll show you around the campus and explain everything in more detail. She paused at the threshold, and Jeremy, thank you. This opportunity means more to me than you can imagine. As the door closed behind her, Jeremy sat on the edge of the bed, clothes in hand, trying to process the absurdity of his situation, stranded on an alien campus, research subject for a beautiful red-skinned woman who seemed equal parts brilliant and naive. Well, he muttered to Himself, as he pulled on the shirt, at least, it beats being vaporized ready for the Grand Tour, Kalala asked as Jeremy emerged from the dormitory room, now fully dressed in the strange adaptive clothing. She provided yak. The material felt oddly responsive against his skin, adjusting to his body temperature with subtle, almost imperceptible movements. As ready as I'll ever be, Jeremy replied, still processing his bizarre situation. Lead the way, Professor. Keela's violet eyes sparkled with amusement. I'm not a professor, yet just a senior student, but with your help that title might not be far off. She guided him down a corridor that seemed to shift subtly as they walked, the walls occasionally becoming transparent to reveal breathtaking views of space. Jeremy couldn't help but stare at the massive structure, extending outward in all directions, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, domes, and garden spaces suspended in the void. Welcome to Galactic Confluence University, Kella announced proudly, the premier educational institution in the Seven Systems, home to over 300 species and 12,000 students. As they entered what appeared to be a central atrium, Jeremy froze. The space was teeming with alien life beings of every conceivable shape. Size and color moved through the area with purpose. Some appeared vaguely humanoid, while others defied categorization. Entirely floating orbs of light conversed with tentacled creatures. Tall, willowy beings with iridescent skin browsed holographic displays, alongside squat, armored individuals that reminded Jeremy of walking tanks. Holy, he breathed unconsciously, moving closer to Kyla. Overwhelming, isn't it? She said sympathetically. Don't worry, most species here have never seen a human before, but they're generally respectful of biological diversity. Generally, Jeremy questioned, noticing several curious stares already directed his way. Well, there are always exceptions, Kyla admitted, which brings me to something important you should know. She guided him to a quieter alcove, her expression turning serious. Humans are classified as a protected species under galactic concordant regulations. Protected? What does that mean exactly? It means Earth is essentially considered a wildlife preserve, she explained carefully. Your species hasn't developed faster than light travel independently, yet so contact is strictly regulated. Most galactic citizens view humans as well as what Jeremy pressed a sinking feeling in his stomach as promising but underdeveloped. Keela finished diplomatically, something like intelligent children. Jeremy felt his face flush with indignation. We've split the atom, mapped our genome, and landed on our moon. We're hardly children by galactic standards. Those are kindergarten achievements, Kayla said gently, but that's what makes you so fascinating. Your species accomplishes so much despite your limitations. Your adaptability, creativity, and determination are unmatched. Before Jeremy could respond, a deep, resonant voice interrupted them. So the rumors are true, you've acquired a human specimen. They turned to find a tall, imposing figure regarding them with cold interest. His skin was a metallic blue-gray with rigid running along his hairless skull. His eyes, 4 of them arranged in a diamond pattern, blinked into dependently. As they focused on Jeremy, Professor Kyla acknowledged, her posture stiffening. This is Jeremy Hayes. He's participating in my research. Voluntarily fascinating, Krell said, circling Jeremy. Like a predator, such primitive physiology, yet surprisingly robust. The musculature suggest regular physical training. I'm standing right here, Jeremy growled, and I can understand every word you're saying. Krell's upper eyes widened slightly. It speaks with remarkable coherence. Tenari, you've outdone yourself. Perhaps your research might be salvageable. After all, Keela's red skin darkened with what Jeremy guessed was The equivalent of a blush my research methodology has been approved by the ethics committee. Professor Jeremy is a research participant, not a specimen semantics. Krell dismissed human. I would be interested in conducting some comparative physiological assessments. My laboratory is far better equipped than the student facilities. His name is Jeremy Kyla. Interjected firmly, and he's already committed to my research program. Krell's four eyes narrowed. Need I remind you, student Tari, that as department head I have priority access to all research subjects of significant scientific value. Jeremy stepped forward, drawing himself to his full height, still a head shorter than Krell, but his military bearing made up for it. Need I remind you, Professor, that I'm not a lab rat to be passed around. I've agreed to work with Kyla, not you. The alien professor regarded Jeremy with newfound interest, remarkable such territorial aggression, despite being in an entirely unfamiliar environment. Perhaps there's something to your theories about human adaptability. After all, Tanari. He turned to leave, but not before adding, we'll discuss this further, student. My laboratory remains at your disposal for now. As Kell departed, Jeremy noticed Kyla trembling slightly. You okay, Professor? Kell is influential, she said quietly, and not accustomed to being refused. Seems like a real Jeremy. Observed. Yala's translator must have captured the sentiment perfectly, because she burst into melodious laughter. That's one way of putting it. Come on, let's continue the tour before we attract more attention. As they moved through the campus, Jeremy became increasing and aware of the stares following them, some curious, some wary, some openly hostile. He'd been in enough combat zones to recognize when he was being sized up as a potential threat. Why do I get the feeling I'm not welcome here? He murmured to Kyla. It's not you specifically, she explained. Humans have a reputation. Your species' history is filled with remarkable achievements, but also with conflict and aggression. Some more conservative species considered humans potentially dangerous. And what do you think? Jeremy asked, suddenly curious about her perspective. Kaya's violet eyes met his, and something in her gaze made his pulse quicken. I think humans are fascinating. Your capacity for adaptation, for emotional connection, for overcoming impossible odds. It's unlike anything in the galaxy. Her hand brushed against his as they walked, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through his system. Her skin was warmer than humans, with a texture like velvet. Sorry, she said quickly, withdrawing her hand. I forgot about human personal space protocols. It's fine, Jeremy assured her, surprised to find he meant it. Cultural differences, right now. That's part of your research. Yes, Kyala confirmed, her silver hair catching the light as she nodded, including physiological responses to various stimuli. Your heart rate just increased by approximately 20% from that brief contact. Jeremy felt heat rise to his face. You can tell that my species has naturally enhanced sensory perception, she explained. I can detect subtle changes in your body temperature, heart rate, pupil dilation. She trailed off, her own skin darkening slightly. It's purely scientific observation, right? Jeremy said, not entirely convinced. Purely scientific. As they continued their tour, Jeremy found himself increasingly drawn to Keela's animated explanations and genuine enthusiasm. Despite his predicament, he couldn't help but be fascinated by this new world and by her. When they finally returned to the dormitory, Kyla paused at the door. I've arranged for you to have your own quarters adjacent to mine for research convenience. Of course, Jeremy echoed, a smile tugging at his lips. Despite everything, rest well, Jeremy Hayes, Kyla said softly, and tomorrow we begin in the real research. Something in her tone made Jeremy wonder exactly what that research might entail. You want me to what? Jeremy stared at Kyla in disbelief. as she laid out her plan for the day. Attend classes with me. She repeated, adjusting the collar of the new outfit. She'd provided him a more formal version of yesterday's adaptive clothing. It's perfect for my research. I need to observe how you process and respond to advanced concepts and how others react to your presence. I'm not exactly qualified for alien university courses. Jeremy pointed out my degrees in tactical operations, not whatever the hell nonlinear quantum consciousness is. He gestured at the holographic schedule. Floating between them, Keela's lips curved into that now familiar smile that made his chest tighten. That's precisely what makes it fascinating. Your species approaches problems differently. Your perspectives might be illuminating. Jeremy sighed, knowing he was fighting a losing battle. Fine, but if anyone tries to dissect me, I'm out. Deal. Killer laughed, the sound like wind chimes. Though I should warn you, Professor Krell is teaching the afternoon seminar. Jeremy groaned. Great. Just what I needed. The first class, comparative xenobiology, was held in a circular chamber with tiered seating. As they entered, the buzz of conversation died immediately. Dozens of alien faces turned toward them, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright alarm. Is that a human? Whispered a being with translucent skin, its internal organs shifting hypnotically as it spoke. I thought they were quarantined to their solar system. Another student with feathered appendages, muttered the professor, a six-limbed insectoid being clicked its mandibles excitedly. Student Tenari, I received your request, but I didn't actually believe. Please bring your research subject forward. Participant Kyla corrected firmly. This is Jeremy Hayes, and he's participating voluntarily in my thesis. Research. Jeremy stepped forward, drawing on every diplomatic briefing he'd received during military training. Thank you for allowing me to observe your class, he said, keeping his voice steady despite the scrutiny. The professor's compound eyes gleamed. Remarkable articulation, class. This is an unprecedented opportunity. Today's scheduled lecture on Allen respiratory systems seems particularly apt. Human, would you be willing to demonstrate your breathing apparatus? I'd prefer to keep my clothes on, Jeremy replied, dry, earning a few translator delayed laughs from the students. The professor tilted its head, apparently processing the humor. Just fascinating. Very well, please be seated. As the lecture progressed, Jeremy found himself increasingly engaged. Despite the advanced terminology, the concepts weren't entirely foreign. Biology was biology, even across species. When the professor opened the floor for questions, he surprised himself by raising his hand. The adaptive respiratory filtration you described. Humans have something similar, though more primitive. Our nasal passages filter particulates, and our immune system targets foreign bodies. We've also developed artificial respirators for hostile environments. The classroom erupted in murmurs. The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Jeremy guessed was excitement, a cogent observation, perhaps the classification committee has underestimated human cognitive development. Student Tenari, your research subject participant shows remarkable comprehension. Kyla beamed with pride, her hand briefly squeezing Jeremy's thigh under the desk. The touch sent an electric current through him, and he caught her violet eyes widening slightly as she undoubtedly sensed his physiological response. Sorry, she whispered, quickly removing her hand. Cultural differences. Maybe we should discuss those differences more thoroughly, Jeremy whispered back, surprising himself with his boldness. For your research, of course. Kala's red skin darkened noticeably. Of course. Research. The morning passed in a blur of classes, each more bizarre than the last. In theoretical physics, Jeremy's primitive understanding of causality apparently offered a refreshing perspective. In galactic history, his questions about human exclusion from interstellar politics sparked a heated debate. By lunchtime, Jeremy had become something of a celebrity. Students crowded their table in the dining hall, peppering him with questions about Earth-human biology and cultural practices. Is it true humans only have two genders? Asked a gelatinous being that appeared to be constant, constantly shifting between forms. Do you really sleep horizontally for 8 hours? Every cycle? Inquired another. Why do you cover your reproductive organs with fabric when they are not used? Questioned a third. Jeremy fielded the questions as best he could, alternately amused and mortified through it all. Kayala sat beside him, her thigh occasionally pressing against his each contact, sending waves of warmth through his body. You're enjoying this, he accused her during a brief lull. Immensely, she admitted, violet eyes sparkling. Your responses are providing invaluable data on human social adaptability. Glad I could help, he muttered, though he couldn't suppress a smile. Their afternoon, however, took a decidedly unpleasant turn when they arrived at Professor Krell's advanced Xenos psychology seminar. The four-eyed professor's face remained impassive, but Jeremy could sense his displeasure. Student Tari, human, how educational that you've joined us today. The seminar began innocuously enough, with Krell lecturing on cognitive development across species, but soon his examples began to focus exclusively on primitive responses to stress, fear, and aggression, with pointed references to human history. Consider the human tendency toward territorial violence, Krell said, activating a holographic display of Earth's major conflicts. Their brief history is dominated by warfare, often over arbitrary geographical boundaries or more ideological differences. Jeremy felt his jaw tighten, but remained silent. Professor Killa interjected, many developing species exhibit similar patterns before achieving social maturity. The Arcturian hegemony had 3 planetary civil wars before their renaissance. Indeed, G. Crow conceded, though they didn't possess nuclear capabilities during their aggressive phase. Perhaps we could examine the humans' responses to simulated threat scenarios. A practical demonstration would be most illuminating. Before Kyla could object, the room darkened in holographic projections, surrounded Jeremy. Snarling predators, explosions, weapons pointed directly at him. His military training kicked in instantly. He dropped into a defensive stance, muscles tensed for combat. Fascinating, Krell observed, clinically. Note the immediate physiological preparation for violence. Heart rate elevated, adrenaline spiking, pupils dial-aided. Stop this, Kayala demanded, rising from her seat. This wasn't approved by the ethics committee, merely a harmless demonstration, Krell replied smoothly as the holograms vanished. The human was never in actual danger. Jeremy straightened, controlling his breathing with effort. Nice try, Professor, but I recognize those as projections immediately. My primitive brain can distinguish between real and simulated threats. A murmur ran through the class. Krell's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, the only indication of his annoyance. Interesting. Perhaps next time we'll try something more immersive after class. Kyla pulled Jeremy into an empty Carter, her expression troubled. I'm so sorry. That was completely inappropriate. He's trying to prove humans are dangerous, Jeremy said, to discredit your research. Partly, Kyla admitted, but I think he genuinely wants to study you himself. Your respawn is challenges theories about developmental psychology. Jeremy leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. Great, I'm a walking thesis. Contradiction. Kyla moved closer, her scent cinnamon and ozone enveloping him. You're much more than that, she said softly, her hand reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing his jawline with gentle curiosity. Your responses today were remarkable. The air between them seemed to charge with electricity. Jeremy found himself leaning into her. Touch his own hand, moving to the small of her back. More research, he asked his. Voice husky, something like that, she whispered, her face tilting up toward his. The moment hung suspended between them, full of possibility, until a group of students rounded the corner, forcing them to step apart. We should continue this discussion, Kyla said, her voice slightly breathless, in private for thorough documentation. I'm all for thorough research, Jeremy replied, surprised at how much he meant it. You're telling me this is how students relax around here? Jeremy asked incredulously, staring at the swirling vortex of multicolored energy that dominated the center of what Kyla had called the recreation dome. 2 days had passed since the incident in Krell's class, and Kyla had insisted Jeremy needed to experience the social side of university life. The massive spherical chamber buzzed with activity as students of various species engage with the energy field in ways Jeremy couldn't begin to comprehend. The harmonic confluence is one of our most popular recreational activities, Kella explained, her silver hair shimmering under the pulsating lights. It responds to neural patterns, creating a shared experiential matrix in English. Kyla laughed. It's like swimming in each other's thoughts, a bit like your virtual reality, but directly connected to IS rather than sensory inputs. Jeremy watched as a group of students seemingly melted into the energy field, their forms becoming translucent as they merged with the swirling colors. I think I'll pass, he said firmly. Got anything more physical? Kaya's violet eyes sparkled with mischief. Physical recreation, I believe I can accommodate that request. The way she said it sent a pleasant shiver down Jeremy's spine. Their almost moment in the corridor had been replaying in his mind for due, along with the increasingly frequent accidental touches during their research sessions. This way, she said, leading him to a different section of the dome. This might be more familiar. The area she indicated contain what appeared to be a zero-gravity chamber. Inside, students bounced off walls and each other in what looked like an elaborate game of three-dimensional tag. Now that's more my speed, Jeremy grinned after a brief explanation of the rules, which seemed to involve capturing glowing orbs while avoiding being tagged by opponents. They entered the chamber. The sudden weightlessness was disorienting at first, but Jeremy's military training in Zerog environments quickly kicked into Kale's evident surprise. He adapted immediately, using controlled bursts from the propulsion units attached to his wrist to navigate the space with precision. You've done this before, she accused playfully as he snagged an orb right from her grasp. Something similar, he admitted, executing a perfect flip to avoid a charging tentacled student, part of standard space ops training. As the game progressed, Jeremy found himself genuinely enjoying the competition. The alien students, initially wary, soon incorporated him fully into their play, shouting encouragement and good-natured taunts that his translators struggled to keep up with. When they finally exited, breathless and laughing, Kyla's skin glowed with exertion, making her appear even more radiant than usual. You continue to surprise me, Jeremy Hayes, she said, her voice low and intimate despite the crowded surroundings. Your adaptability is remarkable. Just wait until you see me dance, he quipped, though the idea of holding her close sent his pulse racing. And dance? Her eyes widened with interest. Your species uses rhythmic movement as social bonding, among other things, he replied with a wink before she could respond. A familiar cold voice interrupted them. Student Tanari, human. How fortuitous to encounter you here. Professor Krell stood before them all. 4 eyes focused intently on Jeremy. Beside him hovered a small metallic sphere that emitted occasional beeps and clicks. Professor Killa acknowledged stiffly. We were just enjoying some recreational time indeed. And how Convenient that I should find you. The ethics committee has approved my request for comparative cognitive testing. Krell's thin lip, curved into what might have been a smile. Your human subject is required to participate in a standardized assessment tomorrow morning. Jeremy crossed his arms. And if I refuse? Then student Tarun's research authorization would unfortunately be subject to review. Krell replied smoothly. After all, if you're unwilling to participate in standard university protocols, questions might arise about the voluntary nature of your overall participation. Kyla's hand found Jeremy's arm. Her touch a silent warning. What kind of testing are we talking about, Professor? Nothing invasive, Krell assured them, the metallic sphere bobbing beside him, merely a series of cognitive and emotional response evaluations. My assistant here, he gestured to the sphere of her will administer the test in my laboratory. I want to be present, KY insisted. That would invalidate the results, Krell countered. But you may observe remotely. Of course. After the professor departed, Jeremy turned to Kyla. HEK up to something definitely, she agreed, her brow furrowed with concern. But we don't have much choice. If he revokes my research authorization, you could be placed in quarantine pending diplomatic processing. Jeremy ran a hand through his hair in frustration. So we play along, but stay alert. Yes, Colin nodded, then hesitated. There is something that might help, a way to prepare you for whatever test he's planning. I'm listening. My species has a particular ability. We can create a temporary neural link. It would allow me to share information directly. What help you understand what to expect from various testing methodologies. You want to link our minds? Jeremy asked, both intrigued and apprehensive. It's not full telepathy, she clarified quickly, more like sharing a dream space where information can be exchanged. It requires physical contact and mutual consent. The implications hung between them, charged with possibilities beyond mere information exchange. Would it help me beat whatever game Krell is playing? Jeremy asked finally. I believe so, Kyala said, and it would provide exceptional data for my research on human neuroplasticity. Jeremy smiled. Always the scientist, not always, she replied softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. They returned to Kyla's quarters, the atmosphere between them shifting from playful to something deeper, more charred. The room seemed smaller, somehow more intimate, as she dimmed the lights and gestured for him to sit on the edge of her bed. This requires close proximity, she explained, settling beside him there. Thighs touching and complete openness. How close are we talking? Jeremy asked, his voice rougher than intended in answer. Kyla took his hand in hers, guiding them to rest on either side of her face. Her skin was warm, almost hot to the touch, and incredibly soft like this. She whispered, placing her own hands against his temples. Now close your eyes and focus on my voice. Jeremy complied, acutely aware of her breath mingling with his, the subtle scent of her skin enveloping him. Open your mind to me, Jeremy, she murmured, her forehead gently pressing against his. Let me in. What followed was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a rush of sensation as her consciousness brushed against his, tentative at first, then more boldly images flowed between them, his memories of Earth, her childhood on a world with twin suns, his military training, her academic pursuits, and beneath it all unmistakable currents of desire, his for her, and to his surprise and delight hers for him. Their mutual attraction laid bare in this shared mental space, impossible to hide or deny. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with more than just the ion of the mental link. That was Jeremy began, struggling to find words. Unexpected, Kyla finished, her violet eyes wide with wonder. I've never experienced such compatibility before. Their faces remained close, the air between them electric, with possibility. This time there was no interruption, no hesitation, just the inevitable gravitational pull of two bodies meant to collide. Jeremy awoke to the mental pressure of Kaya's arm, draped across his chest, her red skin contrasting starkly with his own, the events of the previous night replayed in his mind, the Neuralink. That had evolved into something far more intimate, more profound, than either had anticipated. Their connection had transcended mere physical attraction, becoming a union of minds and bodies that defied the boundaries of their different species. He studied her sleeping form, marveling at how someone so alien could feel so familiar now. The silver-white hair sped across the pillow, the subtle pulsing glow beneath her crimson skin that intensified with her heartbeat, all of it now precious to him, in ways he couldn't have imagined when he first woke up in this strange place. Kyla stirred, violet eyes fluttering open to meet his gaze. "You're starring," she murmured, a smile playing at her lips. "Hard not to," he replied, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "I'm still trying to convince myself this is real." "Which part?" she asked, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Finding yourself on an alien campus, or waking up with me?" "Definitely. The second part," Jeremy said, pulling her closer, "though I'm still not convinced Krell's test today isn't going to be a nightmare." The mention of the professor's name seemed to break the spell. Kyla sighed, reluctantly pulling away to sit up. "We should prepare. The neural link should help, but Krell is full." "What exactly should I expect?" Jeremy asked, watching as she slipped from the bed and began retrieving her clothing. "Based on his research focus, he'll likely attempt to provoke emotional responses, fear, anger, aggression, the kinds of reactions that would support his theories about human volatility." She paused, turning to face him with concern etched across her features. "He'll try to make you lose control." Jeremy nodded grimly. "Not my first psychological evaluation. Military puts us through the ringer to make sure we can handle stress without breaking. This will be different." Kay warned. "Krell has access to technology that can simulate experiences indistinguishable from reality. He could place you in scenarios designed specifically to trigger human threat responses. Then I'll just have to disappoint him," Jeremy said. With more confidence than he felt, they arrived at Krell's laboratory, precisely on time, finding the professor waiting with his floating sphere ICAL assistant and two other faculty members Jeremy hadn't met before. "The human arrives," Krill announced, his four eyes blinking in sequence. "These are Professors Neth and Doran, who will be observing today's assessment for the Xenos Picology departments. Records." The professors, one a willowy being with bark-like skin, the other a short amphibious creature with bulbous eyes, nodded in greeting. "Student Tanari, you may observe from the adjacent room." Krell continued, gesturing to a transparent partition. "The test eing chamber is this way. Human, his name is Jeremy." Kyla reminded firmly. "Of course," Krell replied, without sincerity. "This way." Jeremy, the testing chamber was a featureless white room with a single chair in the center. As Jeremy took his seat, the walls seemed to shimmer slightly. "This is a neural responsive environment," Kell explained from a speaker somewhere above it. "Will adapt based on your cognitive patterns. The assessment begins now." The room does dissolved around Jeremy, reforming into a perfect replica of the military transport ship he'd been on before his abduction. The simulation was flawless. He could feel the vibration of the engines, smell the recycled air, hear the hum of equipment. "Status report, Lieutenant Hayes," came a voice he recognized as his commanding officer. Jeremy almost responded automatically before catching himself. This wasn't real. The knowledge from Keela's neural link helped him identify the subtle inconsistencies. They Lighting was too uniform, the air too clean. Interesting resistance, Krell's voice commented, though it seemed to come from nowhere. Let's increase the stimulus. The simulation shifted. Now Jeremy found himself in what appeared to be a combat zone, explosions in the distance, the smell of smoke and blood, the weight of a weapon in his hands. A figure appeared ahead, humanoid, but clearly alien, raising what looked like a weapon. Every instinct screamed at Jeremy to fire, to eliminate the threat. Instead, he deliberately lowered his weapon and called out, I recognize this as a simulation designed to trigger defensive aggression. I declined to participate. The scene flickered momentarily, Krell's frustration, almost palpable in the brief static. Remarkable control, one of the observing professors commented from somewhere beyond the simulation. The scenarios continued, each more provocative than the last. A recreation of Earth under alien attack, a simulation of being physically threatened, even an attempt to trigger territorial aggression by simulating threats to KY. Through each one, Jeremy maintained his composure, identifying the manipulations and refusing to react as expected. When the final simulation faded and the white room reappeared, Jeremy found himself exhausted but triumphant. Krell stood before him, all four eyes narrowed in what could only be described as scientific frustration. Your result are anomalous, the professor stated flatly. Most species exhibit predictable response patterns to threat stimuli. Maybe you should update your theories, Jeremy suggested, unable to resist the jab before Kell could respond. The door slid open, and Kyla rushed in, followed by the two observing professors. Extraordinary performance, the bark skin Professor Neth commented, extending a branch-like appendage toward Jeremy. Your cognitive control mechanisms are highly developed for a species at your technological stage. Indeed, agreed Professor Doran, blinking his bulbous eyes rapidly. The implications for our classification protocols are significant. Krell's posture stiffened. One subject hardly constitutes grounds for reclassification. Further testing is clearly required. I believe we've gathered sufficient data for today. Neth interrupted smoothly. The ethics committee will be most interested in these results. Professor Krell. As they left the laboratory, Kayala could barely contain her excitement. You were amazing, the way you recognized each simulation and refused to engage. Krell was practically seething. I had a good teacher, Jeremy replied, giving her a meaningful look that made her red skin darken with pleasure. Their victory was short-lived. However, as they entered the main atrium of the science building, they became aware of the stares and whispers following them. A group of students quickly dispersed as they approached, but not before Jeremy caught fragments of their conversation. I'm bonded with a human against natural order Taruns. Research compromised. Kay's posture stiffened, her hand finding Jeremy's and squeezing tightly. What's going on? He asked quietly. News travels fast in closed environments, she replied, her voice tight. It seems our connection has become public. Knowledge is that a problem for some? Yes, interspecies relationships aren't unheard of, but humans are still classified as a protected species. Some will view our relationship as inappropriate scientifically, ethically, even biologically, as if to confirm her words. A tall serpentine student blocked their path, yellow eyes fixed on Kella with unmistakable disapproval. Researcher Tanari, the student hissed, multiple tongues flickering. The Xenoethics Society requests your presence at an emergency meeting regarding your research methods. Tell them I'll consider their request when it's properly submitted through academic channels, Kay replied coolly. The serpentine student's gaze shifted to Jeremy, contempt evident in those slitted eyes. The human's presence is corrupting the academic environment. Its removal would be beneficial to all. Jeremy felt a Surge of anger, but controlled it, remembering Krell's test. Funny. I was just thinking the same about you, he replied with a deliberately calm smile. The student recoiled slightly, clearly not expecting such composure after a moment of tense silence. It slithered away, but the encounter left an uneasy feeling in its wake. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Jeremy asked, as they continued walking, now acutely aware of the attention they were attracting. Kyla nodded grimly. Krell has allies among the traditionalist factions. If he can't prove humans are dangerous, he'll try to discredit my research by suggesting our relationship has compromised scientific objectivity. And has it? Jeremy asked softly. Kyla stopped, turning to face him, fully heedless of the staring students around them. My research has never been more illuminating. She said, her violet eyes intense. What I've learned about humans, about you, goes beyond anything I could have discovered through conventional methods. Her hand reached up to touch his face, a public declaration that sent a ripple of murmurs through the atrium. Let them talk. Some boundaries are worth crossing. The Grand Assembly Hall of Galactic Confluence University hummed with anticipation. Tiered seating arranged in a perfect circle surrounded a central platform where 5 senior faculty members sat behind an elevated bench. The hall was packed with students and professors from every department, drawn by the unprecedented nature of the hearing. Jeremy sat in the front row, uncomfortably aware of the hundreds of alien eyes fixed on him. Beside him, Professor Neth leaned over his bark-like skin, creaking softly. Quite the turnout. The professor observed. Your presence has sparked the most significant academic debate this institution has seen in decades. Lucky me, Jeremy muttered, tugging at the formal university attire. Kyla had insisted he wear a high-collared jacket in deep blue that apparently signified his status as a research participant of distinction. The doors at the far end of the hall slid open, and Kyla entered, her silver hair braided elaborately down her back, wearing formal academic robes in deep crimson that matched her skin. Despite the gravity of the situation, jury couldn't help but admire her poise as she approached the central platform across the hall. Professor Krell sat surrounded by supporters, his 4 eyes narrowed in anticipation. The lead administrator, an ancient being with translucent skin through which complex neural patterns were visible, activated the chamber's acoustics. This academic review has been convened to address concerns regarding student Tanar's research methodology and ethical conduct, the administrator announced, voice resonating perfectly throughout the hall. Specifically, the allegation that her personal relationship with her human research subject has compromised scientific objectivity and violated the protected species non-interference protocols. Callie stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering. Administrators, colleagues, fellow students, I stand before you not to deny my relationship with Jeremy Hayes, but to challenge the very foundations upon which these allegations rest. A murmur rippled through the assembly. The classification of humans as a protected species is based on outdated assessments conducted over 2 centuries ago. Yala continued, my research, including the neural link I established with Jeremy, has proved compelling evidence that humans possess cognitive capabilities and emotional complexity far beyond our previous understanding. Professor Krell rose from his seat. The neural link itself represents a gross violation of research protocols. Such intimate connection inevitably compromises objectivity. On the contrary, Kella countered it, revealed truths inaccessible through conventional observation, the human capacity for adaptation, for empathy, for complex decision-making under stress, all demonstrated conclusively through both the link and subsequent testing, She activated a holographic display showing Jeremy's test results from Krell's laboratory, as your own data confirms. Professor Krell's upper eyes blinked. Rapidly in agitation, one specimen hardly constitutes grounds for reclassification. The human's military background makes him an outlier not representative of a species. Then perhaps we should reconsider how we evaluate its sentient potential. Came a new voice. Professor Donon waddled to the center of the chamber, bulbous eyes swiveling independently. I've reviewed student Tanari complete research data. The human demonstrates cognitive patterns consistent with advanced empathic reasoning capabilities we've traditionally associated only with species centuries beyond their technological development. A Jeremy watched as the debate unfolded, arguments flying back and forth about human potential, research ethics, and the nature of interspecies relationships. What struck him most was how they discussed humanity, sometimes dismissively, sometimes admiringly, but always as if humans represented some fascinating puzzle to be solved. Finally, the lead administrator raised a hand for silent student Tanari. You have established that your research has merit. However, the question of your personal involvement remains. How do you respond to the allegation that your relationship compromises your scientific findings? Kyla took a deep breath, her violet eyes finding Jeremy in the crowd. I would argue that true understanding can never be achieved through cold observation. Alone, my connection with Jeremy has not compromised my research, it has elevated it. She stepped forward, passion evident in her voice. The greatest scientific breakthroughs in galactic history have come not from detachment but from immersion, from crossing boundaries previously thought inviolable. The hall fell silent, hanging on her every word. What I have learned about humans, about their capacity for adaptation, for connection, for growth, could never have been discovered from behind a clinical barrier. And yes, in the process, I developed feelings for Jeremy Hayes, of feelings that have only deepened my understanding of human emotional complexity. She turned to face Kell directly. Some would call this a compromise of objectivity. I call it the most profound research methodology possible, to not just study, but to understand, to not just observe, but to experience. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall, some supportive, others skeptical. The administrators conferred among themselves, neural patterns visibly pulsing beneath translucent skin. After what seemed an eternity, the lead administrator spoke. This case presents unprecedented questions about our research methodologies and classification systems. While student Tari approach is unorthodox, her results are undeniably significant. Jeremy held his breath. Therefore, we rule that her research may continue with the following conditions. First, a formal review of human classification status will be initiated based on her findings. As second, all further research must be conducted with full transparency and oversight. The administrator's gaze shifted to Jeremy. And third, the human subject, Jeremy Hayes, must be recognized as an autonomous participant with full rights of consent and refusal. The hall erupted in a cacophony of reactions. Cheers, protests, and heated debates through it all. Kyla's eyes remained locked with Jeremy's, a smile of triumph and relief spreading across her face. As the assembly dispersed, Kyla rushed to Jeremy, throwing protocol to the wind. As she embraced him tightly, "We did it," she whispered against his neck. "You did it," he corrected, pulling back to look at her with admiration. That was one hell of a defense, Professor. Neth approached them, bark-like features arranged in what Jeremy had learned to recognize as a smile. "Congratulations, student Tanari, your thesis defense next month should be considerably less dramatic. By comparison, thank you for your support." Professor Kyla said sincerely. Don't thank me, yet Neth replied, I have submitted a proposal for a joint research initiative, a comprehensive intensive study of human galactic integration potential with you two. As primary researchers, of course. Jeremy blinked in surprise. May a researcher who? Better, Neth asked. You've already proven yourself more than capable of understanding complex concepts, and your perspective would be invaluable. As Neth departed, Jeremy turned to Kyla, still processing the implications. So, I wouldn't be going back to Earth. Kyla's expression grew serious. That's entirely your choice, Jeremy. I would never presume to. He silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. I was a soldier following orders on Earth. Here I could be something more, help bridge the gap between our worlds. He smiled, drawing her closer. Besides, I found something here I never had there. And what's that? She asked, though her darkening skin suggested she already knew the answer. A connection that transcends species. He replied softly. Boundaries worth crossing. Later that night, in the privacy of Kay's quarters, now officially registered as their shared accommodation, they celebrated their victory in the most intimate way possible. Their Neuralink, now stronger than ever, allowed them to experience each other's pleasure, creating a feedback loop of sensation that transcended physical differences. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Kyla traced patterns on Jeremy's chest, her touch sending pleasant shivers through his body. What are you thinking? She asked, Violet eyes studying him with that familiar scientific curiosity, now tempered with affection. Jeremy chuckled. I'm thinking about that first morning, waking up to find you studying me like some fascinating specimen. If someone had told me then where we'd end up, would you have believed them? She finished, wary, smiling. Not a chance, he admitted, but I wouldn't change a thing. Kay propped herself up on one elbow, silver hair cascading over her shoulder. Our research will change how the galaxy views humans. Open doors previously closed to your species, and maybe change how humans view the galaxy. Jeremy added thoughtfully, when contact eventually happens officially. I mean, it will happen sooner than you think. Kyla said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips, especially with advocates like us making the case. As sleep began to claim him, Jeremy reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here, from soldier to specimen to partner in a groundbreaking research initiative that could reshape galactic relations, all because he'd woken up in an alien dorm room to find a beautiful red-skinned woman curiously inspecting him. Some boundaries, it seemed, were definitely worth crossing. The end.